Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Are there any empirical challenges to the evidential problem of evil? That's what we'll be discussing. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm delighted to be joined by not one, but two guests, Dr. Blake McAllister on the right and Dr. Ian Church in the center. Both of them are professors at Hillsdale College, and they are co-authors of a brand new paper titled Empirical Challenges to the Evidential Problem of Evil. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having us.
I will have the paper linked in the description below, so if you're interested in looking into the details, you can go and check that out. So let me just first ask you two, how did you get interested in writing a paper like this? This one's really different because you actually went out and surveyed people, and this is not your typical philosophy paper.
Sure. Do you want me to say something about that, Blake?
Yeah, Ian.
Sure.
Give some background.
So I was raised by psychologists, so heaven help me. I still remember coming home and my parents had games for me to play, right? And so when I went to college, I wanted to be the black sheep of the family and wanted to turn away from psychology. And so I studied philosophy, right? The rebellious son studying philosophy. But lo and behold, the Lord apparently has a sense of humor. My very first job after earning my PhD was working in a graduate school of psychology. And so that's where I met Dr. Justin Barrett, who was a professor of psychology at Fuller Graduate School of Psychology. And he's now the president of Blueprint 1543. And so anyway, he's a good friend of mine, been a mentor. And back at that point, we started talking about how not only how philosophy can and should speak into the human sciences, but also how the human sciences might speak into research within philosophy, in particular philosophy of religion. And so that sort of was the seed, at least for me, for this line of research, that we should try to bring the tools and resources of psychology and cognitive science and bring them to bear on seminal issues within philosophy of religion. And so we started doing some research along those lines. And this paper is a sort of summation, gathering together some of the initial rush of research and trying to see what conclusions we might want to draw from it.
Can you all just say briefly what you aim to show in this paper?
Sure. So the conclusion of our paper is, it's not conclusive, as empirical studies tend to be. It's tentative. We found some data that we think raises some interesting challenges to the evidential problem of evil. Particularly, we used as our kind of seminal example the evidential problem of evil as formulated by William Rowe in his famous 1979 paper. So as Ian said, using the tools of the psychological sciences, we thought, well, let's probe the intuitions behind this argument a little bit. And when we did, we found some things that we think issue a kind of prima facie challenge to the success of that argument. Now, it's just a prima facie challenge. The defenders of Rowe's argument could offer responses, but our point is that a response is needed. There's some interesting results that were, at least from our point of view, not expected.
That's right. Yeah, in many ways, this is just very exploratory and sort of proof of concept, right? This is a new area of research. Not a whole lot has been done in the field of experimental philosophy of religion. And so one of the things we're trying to do in this paper is show that fruitful work can be done, taking the tools and resources of psychology and cognitive science and applying them to the most cited formulation of the problem of evil in the contemporary literature.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a moment ago William Rowe's evidential problem of evil. So why don't we take a minute and just lay out what is Rowe's formulation of the problem of evil?
Sure. So it's a pretty simple modus tollens. If God exists, then there are not any gratuitous evils in the world. The term gratuitous, Rowe uses interchangeably with pointless evils. He has a technical definition of that. Those pointless or gratuitous evils are defined as evils that an omnipotent being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So it doesn't bring about any greater good, doesn't prevent any worse evil. The second premise of the argument is then that there are gratuitous evils in the world, evils that don't bring about any greater good, prevent any worse evil, and so God does not exist. That's the basic framework of the argument.
The first premise is not super controversial. I know that people like William Hasker and I think Michael Peterson and Peter Van Inwagen have raised objections to that first premise. If God exists, there would be no gratuitous evils. They want to say, no, those are compatible. But it seems like, if I'm understanding the literature correctly, many philosophers don't pick on that premise. They'll kind of take that one on board. But what's more controversial is that there are gratuitous evils, the second premise.
That's
right?
Now, I think the challenges to the first premise should be taken quite seriously. They kind of come from a variety of angles. I'm not convinced that the term gratuitousness is really the framework in which we ought to be thinking about these things. But you're right that most of the literature will sort of seed something like the first premise, that if God exists and he is omnipotent, omniscient, loving in the way that many theists think that he is, he's not going to allow gratuitous evils, however exactly we define that. But evils of that sort seem to be out there. There are these evils that we look at and just say, doesn't seem like there's any good reason why a loving, omnipotent, omniscient God would allow this. And so that's really the controversial premise. Ian, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're generally, while there is a lot of really valuable literature on that first premise, I think for our purposes, we're happy just to take that as a given. That's premise, one, Rowe thinks it's not terribly controversial, that theists and atheists are going to agree that if there's a God, then there won't be genuinely pointless suffering in the final analysis. I have some sympathies there, and so I'm inclined just to say, fine, let's take that as a given. And so this is, given that this is a valid argument, which it is, then if that we're taking number one to be true, then everything else hinges on premise two, right? So if premise two, that there is gratuitous evil, that there is pointless suffering, if that turns out to be true, then that's bad news for theism, right? So now if we're sort of saying number one is given, that puts a lot of pressure on number two to see why we should think that's true.
So there are a couple ways of defending that second premise, or giving some sort of justification for it. So can you explain what did Rowe say, or defenders of this argument, what might they say in support of premise two?
Yeah. So Rowe seems to make something like what has been called a no-seum inference in defense of premise two. So he says, look around, we don't see any reason why God would allow this suffering. No greater good that God had to allow this evil in order to bring about. No worse evil that God had to allow this evil to prevent. And in a kind of inductive inference, because we don't see a reason therefore probably there is no reason, or it's at least reasonable to believe that there is no reason. Now, that particular way of arguing for premise 2 is controversial because you have the skeptical theists' reply. Skeptical theism challenges the cogency of that inference. They will point out, and they do this in a variety of ways, but they'll point out that if we're in a context where we shouldn't expect to see the reasons, then the fact that we don't see them isn't good evidence for the conclusion that they're not there. And the skeptical theist goes on to claim that God's reasons for allowing evil, whatever greater goods or worse evils might be logically connected to the instance of evil in front of us, that's one of those areas where we shouldn't expect to be able to see what kinds of connections are there, what kinds of goods are available, evils God might be preventing. And so that inference is not licensed in this particular instance.
And I think it's worth noting here that, like many philosophers, Rowe likes to trade in thought experiments, right? The thought experiments are there to sort of prime our intuitions, to help us to see the point he's trying to make here. And so for our research, we focused on this fawn case quite a bit, so that he gives a brief 2-sentence vignette. It goes a bit like this. So he says, suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. Right. So things get dark pretty quick when you talk about the problem of evil, right? And so part of what's going on here is that we're meant to reflect on this case and try to judge whether or not that's a gratuitous amount of suffering. Does it seem like a pointless bit of suffering? And when I just, as I report on my internal mental states, I read that case and I think, well, yeah, that does seem pointless. I have no idea what the point of that suffering would be. I don't know what sort of greater good might be brought about by it. And so part of what Rowe wants to say here is, well, insofar as it seems to you that this is a gratuitous bit of suffering, then that's some evidence for thinking that it is gratuitous. We're not really clear how much evidence exactly, but it's some evidence for thinking that's gratuitous. And insofar as you have some evidence for thinking that's gratuitous, then that's some evidence against theism, given his argument.
Yeah. So to add on to what Ian's saying here, Ian's actually pointing, I think, out a second way in which even Rowe, maybe it's a little more implicit in Rowe's argument, might be trying to support premise 2, that there are gratuitous evils. Because notice that Rowe's initial statement says, I don't see, it doesn't appear to me that there's a reason for this evil, therefore it's probably gratuitous. What Ian just said there was, it appears to me that it is gratuitous. It's not an absence of reasons that I'm seeing. I think I'm seeing that this evil is pointless. Mm-hmm. And so some of the defenders of Rowe's argument have said, well, look, we don't need to engage in an inference here. It just seems evident to certain people that this evil is pointless. And at least on given certain epistemic principles, the fact that it seems to you that way is going to provide you with some level of evidence that it is, in fact, gratuitous.
I'll just mention this briefly. I'll point people to other interviews that are related to that. I have done an interview with Dr. Justin McBrayer where he gives arguments for skeptical theism and arguments against it. So I can direct people to go listen to that if they want to know more about that type of response. I've also done an interview with Dr. Chris Tucker where he says that seemings can be considered evidence. So at least prima facie evidence. You can accept the way things seem to you unless you have some good reason not to. That's the general sort of principle. So I direct people, go listen to that interview if you're interested in that sort of move. But it sounds like Rowe might appeal to something like that here, or he might at least be implying that that's a way of defending premise 2 is it seems to me that such an evil that Ian described is pointless. And so that's some evidence that it is pointless. Now, that particular move seems to be what you all are targeting. The justification of premise 2 based on this sort of seeming that it is pointless. You're not really responding to that first avenue of let's survey all the possible reasons there could be. It looks like none of them work in this case. You're not pursuing that strategy. You're going with that second strategy. Is that right?
I suppose there's a grain of truth in that, in the sense that I think Ian and I believe that if you're talking to an ordinary person, why, when they encounter an instance of suffering and they conclude that it's gratuitous, why do they draw that conclusion? There's some psychological studies that indicate that our moral judgments in these kinds of areas tend to be much more immediate, emotional, intuitive. You have a strong reaction to the case, and that is sort of driving your judgment. If anything, when reasoning comes in, it's often a kind of post hoc rationalization of your initial gut reaction. And so if that's true of most people, then actually that second way is going to be probably what's driving the problem of evil for the sort of the ordinary person. They're probably not surveying, thinking carefully about all of the all of the possible reasons and finding them lacking. Now, that being said, when we surveyed people, we didn't ask them, is this an intuitive judgment, or have you calculated, thought about this really carefully? And so we're going to get participants, we're not going to be able to tell whether they gave a kind of intuitive snap judgment or whether they thought through it more carefully. Well, we're not going to be able to tell initially. Maybe with follow-up probing, we can see, because we did see differences in how people reacted, and maybe actually the extent to which they stopped, paused, reflected on their initial judgment is indicative with how much they ended up agreeing with Rowe. So, Ian, did you add anything on that?
No, I think that's right. And there might be something to be said about the finding about education levels that we can talk about that later, and maybe sort of reflecting a more careful approach to the kind of thought experiments that Rowe uses.
Well, and notice that, so, I think Ian and I both hold skeptical theism in fairly high esteem. And so notice that if you're not relying on that intuitive snap judgment, if you're going to really think hard about it, then we're going to direct you to that literature. There are people, Justin McBrayer among them, right, among the foremost, who have given strong defenses of skeptical theism. And so you might think that, if it comes to that kind of debate, theism is already in a pretty good shape. But for the ordinary person, this, what you might call common sense problem of evil, may actually be the one that's more pressing in a kind of ordinary context.
Yeah. Okay. So that helps understand the argument that Rowe is making, and that key premise being that there is gratuitous evil, and what might be said in defense of that, relying on this sort of intuition or seeming that this Fawn case is an example of gratuitous evil. Now, what do you all think the ultimate success of Rowe's argument depends on then?
You would need to either have, if we're going with the second way of supporting the second premise, strong intuitions that the instance of evil in front of you is in fact gratuitous. And you would also need to have an absence of defeaters. So you would need to lack considerations that would draw those intuitions into question. Because as soon as you introduce reasons for doubting those intuitions, then whatever initial justification those seemings may have provided for you can be defeated. So that's what we'd be looking for. One, do people have those intuitions? Do they have them strongly? And two, do they have any defeaters that might make them question those intuitions?
And we might also want to know, are those intuitions shared broadly, right? If another group of people who are every bit as intelligent and reflective as I am, just routinely have different intuitions about these sorts of things, then it seems like it at least raises questions about whether or not I should take those intuitions as theory guiding. So that might be a type of defeater, right? If we knew that there were a lot of people who I just didn't have this intuition that maybe my intuition was idiosyncratic in the scope of the expanse of humanity. And so that would be one defeater.
Yeah, so this leads in nicely to the experiment that you all designed. So this is experimental philosophy now. It gets out in the real world. We actually talk to people, and we don't just sit at the armchair and do some things. So that's really neat. And I take it that this experiment is intended to see if there is such a defeater for that seeming that would support premise 2. And Ian, you just mentioned if there are other groups of people that are pretty much my epistemic peers, they're just as reflective as me, equally well educated, as well read, and so on, but they have different seemings than I do, then that might it seems anyway, cast some doubt on my intuition in the case. It would give me a reason to think, well, why should I rely on my intuition in this case over theirs? What makes mine superior? So that's what I take the experiment to be doing. Am I getting the idea roughly correct there?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to be said here. I mean, one of the things I think it's worth noticing here is that with that second premise, right, that there is going to be gratuitous evil in the world. I mean, already there's an empirical element to that, right? We don't know a priori whether or not there's gratuitous evil in the world. It's something. It almost is calling us to go and look and see what's out there. And so I think there are a range of empirical questions we might ask about the argument that Rowe is giving us. And so, in addition to whether or not the intuitions are shared broadly, there might be other questions we might ask about whether or not the fawn in the target thought experiment is significant insofar as it's a fawn and not an adult deer, right? That seems purposeful, right? This is Bambi that we're talking about, an ultra cute critter, and so we might wonder if our intuitions are being driven in that thought experiment by the cuteness of the animal, right? Maybe if we had a thought experiment where a rattlesnake dies in the forest, we might think, well, good, right? I'm not so concerned about that. Or what if it was something like a fawn, a vulture or a boar, both highly intelligent critters, at least on par with fawns, and so presumably capable of the same amount of suffering. But nevertheless, they aren't as dignified, right? They aren't as quintessentially cute as a fawn is. And so we might want to explore whether or not the cuteness of the fawn, the type of animal, is driving intuitions here, right? That's one empirical question, because it could be that if our intuitions are being driven by cuteness, that might give us a defeater as well, right? If I know that the cognitive genesis of some of my intuitions are unreliable, right, then that gives me a defeater, right? And we might think that insofar as my intuitions are driven by cuteness, then that might not be much reason to think that those intuitions are veridic. And so if it's okay, I'll tell you a quick story about sort of conflicting intuitions.
Yeah.
So I grew up watching way too many nature documentaries, and I loved it. I just absolutely loved nature documentaries. And I still remember realizing how much my emotions could be manipulated with some of these things, right? So I'd be watching a documentary about the American bison, and it's the fawning season, and the music is jolly, and the fawn and the bison are being born, and they're so cute, and you're so wobbly, just getting their legs going, and then the music turns, and the wolves are coming, right? The wolves, and oh no, the wolves are going to come after the baby bison, and they get one, and it's terrible, and you cry out, how can this happen in this world? Where is God, right? This kind of stuff, right? A bit of a stretch there, but nevertheless, you have that kind of really strong emotional, moral assessment about these kinds of cases. But then if you go on to watch enough documentaries, you might find yourself watching another documentary about how gray wolves are being reintroduced into Yellowstone, and there's some new wolves there, and they have puppies, and they're so cute. Oh, but they're so hungry. They've had a hard time getting enough kills this year, and hooray, they're killing the baby bison, right? So just by, if you pay enough attention to these kinds of things, you might realize that some psychological mechanisms might lead you to have conflicting intuitions, and which is telling you that those kinds of intuitions might be unreliable. Right. So just by reflecting on the cognitive genesis of some of our intuitions about this fawn case, maybe it's driven by cuteness. We tried to explore that. And if it is, then that would give us another type of defeater. Another empirical question we might ask here is whether or not context plays an important role. And so some scholars have made a big have noted that Rowe's vignette is indeed only 2 sentences long, and we might think, of course, it's going to seem pointless. Of course, the suffering is going to seem gratuitous because there's no context in order to find a point. We might think points are found in context. And so another hypothesis might be that if we give people context, maybe that would greatly diminish the perceptions of pointlessness as well. And there are other sort of empirical questions we might ask along the way, but we'll talk about those in due course.
Well, just to add to what Ian's saying, so we are looking, one of the things that we're looking at is, are there any defeaters that present themselves in the way that Ian has just mentioned? But we're also asking, because a defeater is something that if it appears gratuitous to you, a defeater can make you question that appearance. But we could ask, does it actually appear to many people that it's pointless in the first place? So what is how extensive are these intuitions to begin with? Rowe, and not just Rowe, but people responding to him seem to just assume, yeah, it seems pointless to almost everybody. Rowe has a quote from a later paper where he says, there appears to be near universal agreement that the fawn's suffering is pointless. And that has sort of been a pillar in the conversation around the evidential problem of evil, that, well, you might conclude that we can't tell whether it's pointless ultimately, but at least initially, it seems to basically everybody that this fawn's suffering is pointless. Well, we might ask, is that the case? Do people have these intuitions?
Yeah, so you surveyed a variety of people, and you might want to go ahead and unpack. So you tried in the group that you sampled to look at religion, gender, education, nationality, and Ian already mentioned a couple, cuteness, context, and then you haven't mentioned this one yet, the hunter and butcher. So I guess you can say anything you want about those, but you used each one as a way of like generating a hypothesis, right?
Yeah. So I mean, we made some predictions about how intuitions might differ along these various demographic lines. And so one prediction here is to say that men are going to be more likely to agree with Rowe than women. And our reasoning is not terribly sophisticated here. It's just that men are much more likely to be atheists. Right? One of the greatest predictions of atheism and agnosticism is testosterone. And so that's something we were expecting to see in our results. We thought atheists are going to be much more likely to agree with Rowe than non-atheists. And so just thought that if men are more likely to be atheists, then we might see a slant to where men are more likely to agree with Rowe on average than women. For similar reasons, we thought agreement with Rowe would increase with education level, because there's empirical research has shown that in general, as people become more and more educated, they're more and more likely to be atheistic or agnostic. And so for the same sort of reason, we thought that, well, if that's if there's a greater number of people who are atheistic and agnostic in that group of people, then we might think that's more likely to be a group of people that's going to agree with Rowe. We weren't really sure, we didn't have really strong convictions about nationality or ethnicity, but we thought, well, look, Rowe's working within the American Academy. So we thought that people in the U.S. would be more likely to share Rowe's intuitions than maybe other nationalities. Rowe's working within the Anglophone academic world, a world that's historically been predominantly populated by people of European descent. And so we might expect people who identify as white would be more likely to agree with Rowe than average. So we're just seeing if that's what happened. That was our hypothesis, and we were just curious to see if that would be the case. And also, we thought that religion would play an important factor for reasons we've already said. That if you're going to be if you're an atheist or an agnostic, we thought you're going to be much more likely to agree with Rowe. And so we wanted to explore that as well. When it comes to the hunter slash butchering question, here we might just sort of wondered if maybe intuitions might differ amongst people who are more intimately connected to where their meat comes from. Right. So in my world, at least, my main sort of way I interact with my meat is just when I pick it up at the store. It's prepackaged and as pretty as meat can be, I suppose. And don't really think too much about where it comes from. And so that might leave me to maybe anthropomorphize animals more than I might otherwise do. And so we thought that people might find people who have more regular exposure to hunting and or butchering animals might actually be less likely to agree with Rowe's intuitions about this fawn case.
Okay, so those were the hypotheses that you came up with. Now, why don't we say something about the design of the experiment, and then I want to talk about the results, because the results are really provocative.
Sure.
Like and we'll say, we're limited on what we can conclude from it, but they're pretty provocative results. So why don't we say something first about the design of the experiment?
Sure. So we had over 1,500 participants take our survey, and we used the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform, which is a platform that's pretty good at getting a lot of data across a wide range of people. And so 1,500 people, and those 1,500 people were immediately sorted into two groups. One group had a high context condition. The other group had a no context or low context condition, right? They pretty much just got the vignette as it's found in Rowe's original paper. The high context group had a paragraph beforehand just talking about when and why forest fires might occur, and the role forest fires play within an ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. Some context to forest fires. And then they're asked the same sort of questions. But then each one of those groups is subdivided into 6 other pots, right? So we gave some people a vignette with a fawn. We gave other people the vignette with a boar, another vignette with a vulture. And then we also, because I was convinced that cuteness played an important role here, I really tried to ratchet it up in some of these examples, right? So I tried to include pictures. So I found we used so some people got a condition of the fawn with a picture, and I tried to find the cutest blasted picture of a fawn I could find, and then I tried to find pictures of vultures and boars that are less than flattering. So I really tried to find unflattering pictures of boars and vultures to just ratchet down the cuteness to see if we can sort of locate the cuteness in reaction and see if there's anything there. Okay, so fawn, boar, and vulture conditions, picture, no picture, and then context, no context. And so we had the 12 conditions in all with around 125 people in each one of those 12 pods. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was a good outline there.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're looking at on a scale the level of agreement or disagreement with Rowe's conclusion.
Yeah,
that
right.
It was pointless.
So that's what that's an important issue, and this is going to be an important topic about taking all this with a grain of salt, is because we have to try to figure out how to measure agreement with Rowe. Okay, and that's a perennial problem with a lot of work in experimental philosophy. How do we know we're actually measuring the intuitions that we think we're measuring? Right. So Rowe,
when you're with the folk, not with philosophers.
Yeah, that's right. And so when it comes to Rowe uses the shorthand of pointlessness in his original paper to sort of be shorthand for not bringing about some sort of greater good or equal or greater good, and not preventing some equal or greater evil, right? And so we gave just one example of trying to measure agreement with Rowe is we asked people, the story you just read is an example of pointless suffering. Okay. We also asked them, some equal or greater evil could have been prevented because of the situation in that story. Some equal or greater good could have been accomplished because of the situation in that story. And if for each one of those 3 items, participants were asked to sort of rate their response on a 7-point Likert scale ranging from 1, strongly disagree, to 7, being strongly agree. Okay. Now, you may notice that we're not talking about God in those questions. Now, of course, we're in Rowe's argument, we're wanting to talk about God and what God would allow, what would be gratuitous for God, and so on and so forth. But it seemed to us really important to not bring God into the picture when we're trying to measure agreement with Rowe, in part because we were thinking that by talking about divinity, we're going to get people's theological orthodoxy, walls to go up, and then they're just going to give the response that they think that their theological orthodoxy would require of them, even if they're atheists, right? Here's the sort of response that they feel like they're supposed to give in light of talking about God and suffering, right? So we thought that would just sort of completely swamp the data if we talked about God, what God would allow, and so on and so forth. So we tried to triangulate on the kinds of intuitions that we thought are going to be salient in Rowe's argument without bringing up God. Now, when it comes to looking at those 3 items on the index, the 3-item index, we can talk about whether or not they highly correlate with each other, and that can be a sign as to whether or not they are actually measuring the same sort of thing. And in that kind of research, we found the 2nd and 3rd items to correlate really nicely together, which is not surprising, right? So this is a question of some equal or greater evil could have been prevented, or some equal or greater good could have been accomplished. Unsurprisingly, those seem to be playing nice together. The first item on the index, so this is the item that said the story that you just read is an example of pointless suffering. That really didn't correlate well with the other 2. Now, whether or not we used the 3-item index or a 2-item index didn't matter for our results, but we just went with a 2-item index because those did correlate well with each other. Does that make sense, Jordan?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's how we were measuring agreement with Rowe. And then after we sort of measured their agreement, we went on to ask them a few other questions, including the question about hunting and butchering and things like that.
Sure. So to add something to clarify what Ian's saying to help interpret the results. So you hear this statement, some greater good could be accomplished because of the situation in the story. If you agree with that, wait, am I getting it wrong here? Ian, if you strongly agree with that, you're going to put a 7 down.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
If you strongly disagree with that, you're going to put a 1 down.
Right.
Or is it the other way?
I think you had it. I think that's right. 7 strongly agree. And one of them was reversed scored. So I have to remember.
Okay, got it. Okay, that's where we're going. Okay, same thing with the statement, some worse evil could have been prevented because of the situation in the story. If you really strongly agree with that, you're going to put a 7. 4 would be agnostic. 1 is going to be that you strongly disagree with that statement. So what we did was we took those scores and we averaged them to get what we kind of called an average level of agreement with Rowe. Now, the way we did that, right, is we added those together and then reversed them. So if you have a score of 7 or above, that means on average the agreement with Rowe. The higher the number, so the maximal score would be 14. If you have a score of 14, you agreed with Rowe as strongly as you could on both of those statements. If you have a score of 7, you were right in the middle.
I think it was 8. I think 8 is the middle.
Because 4 and 4.
Yeah. So it went from 2 to 14. So minimum score you could get was 2 because you had a 2.
Okay.
Yeah. So 2 to 14, midpoint being 8.
Good. This is why I need my partner here. Okay. So really though, 8 then is a kind of a threshold that we can look at. And we can say if the average score is over 8, then the people in this category tended to agree with Rowe. If it's under 8, then they tended to disagree. Now, that's not quite right because notice that in order for an evil to be pointless, it has to not bring about a greater good and not prevent a worse evil. I mean, you could say, oh yeah, the fawn's suffering could bring about a greater good, but I don't know what worse evil it might prevent. So notice that you might agree that it could bring about a greater good, but you might disagree that it prevented a worse evil. Well, that person still doesn't agree with Rowe.
Yeah.
Because they don't think that this is gratuitous. So what we did was we divided them into 3 categories. So if you said that you agreed, either moderately or strongly, you voiced some level of agreement with one of those statements. So you said, yeah, some greater good could have been brought about or some worse evil prevented. Then we put you in the disagreeer camp because you don't think, it doesn't seem to you that this evil is gratuitous. We put the people in the agreeer camp if they disagreed with both of those statements. So they say, I don't think any greater good could come about. I don't think any worse evil could have been prevented. And if you were agnostic about either of those questions, then we put you in the middle, in the agnostic camp. So when we talk about agreeers, agnostics, disagreeers, those are the ways that we're dividing up those categories.
Yeah. So in the results section of your paper, you have a chart that identifies the percent of agreeers for each one of the hypotheses. So the one about religion and let me pull that list back up. Gender, education, cuteness, context, 100, all those are in the paper. There's a chart for each one, and then there's an actual graph that shows the kind of distribution. I'm not putting those pictures on here, but if people are interested in seeing that data, they can go look at it in the paper. What I want to talk about are just kind of your summary of the results. So why don't you go through what the results showed with respect to each one of the hypotheses?
Sure. So as I said previously, we thought that men would on average be more likely to agree with Rowe than women. But we found the opposite to be the case. That statistically, women were more likely to agree with Rowe than men. Now, it's worth noting that both men and women, on average, disagree with Rowe, but there is a statistical significant difference between males and females in the responses here, and females were more likely to agree with Rowe than men. So that was surprising. Now, when it comes to education level, this was another surprising result, at least to me, because we expected that as people became more and more educated, the more and more likely they are to agree with Rowe. Primarily, we were thinking because the more educated you are, the more likely you are to become an atheist. But it's a really nice progression going the other direction. The people who are most likely to agree with Rowe are those who have the least amount of education. And as people become more and more educated, they are less and less likely to agree with Rowe's intuitions on here. And so, I think that's really, I think it's really surprising. And one of the things we've been talking about within our own lab here is trying to figure out why that might be the case, right? And one theory might be that maybe as people become more and more educated, they are ideally more and more aware of just how little they know. And so maybe there's sort of some sort of awareness that maybe their inability to see a point doesn't count as much evidence for thinking that there is no point. Maybe that's part of it. Yeah.
To add to that, Ian, yeah. So, one tool that psychologists use is a framework in thinking about things is System 1 and System 2 cognition. I'm thinking of Daniel Kahneman here, Nobel Prize winner in economics. System 1 is supposed to be intuitive, emotional, sort of these snap judgments, thinking fast. System 2 is when we slow down, we check our intuitions, hold on, is that actually correct? It's slower, and so you might think of it as thinking slow. This is Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Well, one of the things that education might do is it gets you to think slow. It gets you to, maybe you have the initial intuition, but you're more likely to engage System 2 cognition and check that. And as we said earlier, right, once you begin to think about, hold on, it seems gratuitous to me. I don't see any greater good that could be brought about or any worse evil prevented. But can I really tell that? Am I really in a position to know that that's true? The more that you critically examine it, skeptical theist considerations get to come into the picture. And so possibly, we don't know, but possibly what we're seeing with the results in education is that people that are more educated are maybe trained through their education to just say, hold on, can I really tell whether this is true or not? And just to check that initial judgment. That's one theory. Like we said, the results are pretty tentative. We don't exactly know what's going on here, but
more research needs to be done. It's exciting times.
So keep going. That was gender and education.
That's right. So now we're on to nationality. So there were 3 nationalities that had enough participants so that we could say something statistically significant about. And so we had 983 Americans, 299 Indians, and 51 Brazilians. And there were significant differences between all 3 nationality groups. Both Americans and Indians disagree with Rowe on average, though there are significant differences between the 2 of them. Indians disagree with Rowe a lot more than Americans do. But Americans are on average still disagreeing with Rowe. I don't know what's going on in Brazil, but they agree with Rowe on average. Now, with only 51% participants, there's a big margin of error there, but we can say something significant there that there is an uptick in agreement with Rowe in Brazil for whatever reason. Okay.
But it's pretty shocking how vehemently, seemingly, Indians don't agree with Rowe.
Yeah.
The agreement level is very, very low compared to the other groups.
Yeah, and we see that coming through also when it comes to the religion results as well. So ethnicity, we did see significant differences between Asians and Hispanics and Latinos, as well as Asians and whites, as well as significant difference between Black or African Americans and Hispanics or Latinos, as well as the significant difference between Blacks or African Americans and people who identified as white. So we did see really significant differences in ethnicity responses. All of them, on average, disagree with Rowe still. Right, it's another point that's just worth making. And then finally, when it comes to religion, unsurprisingly, atheists agree with Rowe the most. Then followed by agnostics, still in the agree 8+ range on these graphs. Then all other religious groups end up disagreeing with Rowe on average. And the other religious groups that we had enough people representing them were Catholics, Hindus, other Christians, and Protestants. Of those groups, Protestants were the most likely to, were the most, on average, were the closest to agreeing with Rowe, but they still disagree with Rowe on average. Then followed by other Christians, then Catholics, and Hindus really, really disagree with Rowe. So we're going back to Blake's point there. Then when it comes to the other hypotheses about cuteness or the animal type in context, cuteness and animal type did not play a significant role in how people judged these cases. I really thought that would play an important role here. I'm still.
I'm glad you tested that.
I mean, I want to do some follow-up research because but it's pretty clear that animal type and the picture or no picture didn't really have an impact on how people's evaluated these cases. That said, context played a huge role in every condition. If people in every sort of variation, if someone had the high context condition, their perception of their judgment about whether or not the suffering in that story, that vignette, about whether or not it's pointless or gratuitous, tanked, right? It dropped significantly. And so context is playing a really, really important role, seemingly, right? There's lots of questions that we can talk about whether or not context is playing the role that we might think it's playing, or why did we see that result? But in our initial results, it seems like context is playing an important role. We also found that the more someone is likely to be a hunter or to regularly butcher animals, they are far less likely to agree with Rowe as well. So
So,
yeah.
Ian, if I could jump on here. So
Yeah.
maybe though, so these are interesting in terms of the variation between groups, but maybe the headline is just overall, looking at all of our participants, how many people agreed with Rowe, how many people disagreed?
Yeah.
Every group, including Brazilians and atheists and agnostics. So even the groups that had the highest on average level of agreement, the over 50% of each of those groups were in the disagreeer camp, meaning that over 50% of people, even in those groups, said in response to one of those statements, yeah, some greater good could have been brought about because of this, or some worse evil could have been prevented because of this. So just to give you a couple of numbers, so only 12.61% of participants were in the agreeer camp, that they agreed with Rowe on with respect to both of those statements. 75.43% of participants disagreed with Rowe, and everyone else was in the middle. So that's pretty shocking to us. We expected agreement with Rowe to be a lot more pervasive, especially since, again, it's supposed to be agreed that nearly universally people are supposed to intuit that these things are gratuitous. Furthermore, I would add, you might say, okay, I agree with Rowe, but only slightly. So we might ask, how many people strongly disagreed with both of those statements? How many people said, no way, there's no way that a greater good could have been brought about, no way that a worse evil could have been brought about? So the people who strongly agreed with Rowe were only 3.9% of people. So even the people who agree with him tends to be slight agreement. It doesn't tend to be a strong agreement.
Yeah.
So again, we'll discuss in a moment maybe what to make of that. But beyond all of the group variation, those overall numbers, I think, are pretty intriguing on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, this was super fascinating research. So I know this is toward the end of the interview, but this is where we reflect on what these results show. So what do you think these results mean for the overall success of Rowe's argument?
Sure. Well, so like we said at the beginning, it would be far too hasty. I'm thinking of the int here. Don't be hasty, Master Hobbit, right? It'd be hasty to draw the conclusion that, okay, Rowe's argument is bunk, it's destroyed. We certainly don't want to imply that. But what we do think is that these results raise some challenges to the argument. And if one wishes to defend the argument, it calls out for a response. Like, what do we make of these results? There are some things that people can say on behalf of Rowe in response to these findings. So maybe the way to do this would be to sort of lay out, we think there are two different kinds of challenges that might be raised by the results, and then we'll go through them one by one. So the first kind of challenge is just how many people actually have these intuitions that are supposed to provide prima facie justification for thinking that there are gratuitous evils. As we've seen, maybe those intuitions are a lot less extensive and a lot less strong than we thought. The second kind of challenge is, even if you happen to be one of the people who agree with Rowe, so you find yourself in that agreeer camp, you have those intuitions. Do our results give you any defeaters? So those were the two kinds of categories that we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
So with respect to the first kind of challenge, so the extent of these intuitions, the reach of Rowe's argument, a couple of ways that a proponent of Rowe's argument could respond. The first might be to say, well, look, lots of people don't agree with Rowe, but they should. So just because these are, in fact, the intuitions the folk possess, people can be irrational. Maybe they really should conclude that this is pointless suffering, even though they, in fact, don't. So that's always open to proponents of Rowe's argument. Of course, in doing that, they have to wrestle with skeptical theism. They have to wrestle. Now you can no longer appeal to these intuitions. You can no longer say that it's just obvious to people that this is pointless. You can't look at the theist and sort of scoff and say, how could you think that this fawn's suffering might bring about a greater good? Because the person who has these intuitions is in the distinct minority. And so you've now got your work cut out for you. You got to argue that, no, these intuitions, the people who agree with Rowe, they're getting it right here. Now you can do that, but it's certainly harder than we might otherwise have thought.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I'll continue, but I also want to give you guys a chance to jump in if you want to add anything.
That's great.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, keep going.
Sure. Well, so another question you could have is, would more people, so maybe people don't agree with Rowe with respect to just this example, but what if we gave them other examples? Rowe's fawn is a paradigmatic instance, supposedly paradigmatic instance of gratuitous evil, but it does involve an animal. What about if we used humans? Maybe, for instance, we did a study with Dostoevsky's, some of his examples that he gives in the Brothers Karamazov in that chapter, Rebellion. Would that elicit more intuitions in favor of Rowe? So, the fact that they didn't agree with Rowe with respect to this particular instance of evil doesn't mean that they might not agree with him with respect to other instances of evil. So that's, something that we could probe perhaps through further testing. Maybe we can vary the example, use some of those examples involving humans or different kinds of suffering and see if that has any effect. And then finally, I won't add much to what Ian said here, but there's always that tricky question of, are we actually measuring agreement with Rowe? One thing that Ian didn't mention that I have concerns about is to be gratuitous, to be non-gratuitous, I should say. It's not enough that it just happens to bring about some greater good. It needs to be necessary to bring about that greater good. There can't be any other way of achieving that greater good except for this to happen. So there's a kind of modal strength to the claim. And the problem with that is that, if you were to talk about logical necessity or possibility with the folk, they're not going to understand that.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a legitimate challenge here of, when someone's agreeing, okay, yeah, some greater good could have been brought about. Are they saying that it's plausible that this greater good was necessary or could only have been brought about by the fawn's suffering, such that an omnipotent God couldn't have brought about that good in any other way? Maybe we'll talk more about this at the end, but, Ian and I have some follow-up studies planned to try to at least a little bit better add some further statements to make sure that we're really getting at triangulating the intuitions that accurately measure agreement or disagreement with Rowe. Ian, I don't know if you want to jump in on that, but
Yeah, I mean, so we're just going to be trying to expand our index for Rowe agreement, and we're still tweaking that and trying to really think about what kinds of questions are going to be accessible to people, as well as actually sort of dialing in on the kinds of things that Rowe's really after. But again, without trying to bring in God, because I do think that invoking an omnipotent deity is going to make people give their theological Sunday school answer, so to speak, without actually sort of eliciting what their actual intuitions are about the particular case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was so you identified the first challenge that your results would present for Rowe's argument. That's basically just the reach of Rowe's argument. So how many people does this really apply to, this argument?
Yeah.
But you gave 3 lines of response that the proponent of Rowe's argument might make to, in one way or another, either challenge your results or show that the results don't really undermine the justification for that second premise. But there's a second kind of challenge that you say, and that's the actual strength of Rowe's argument, not just the reach of it. So why don't we turn to that?
Yeah, because so even if you do have these intuitions, and maybe more people should have these intuitions, right? Our findings, we think, pose some possible defeaters that should make you question whether those intuitions that you have, whether those initial judgments are in fact reliable. So for instance, when we look at this group variation, and keep in mind, the variation is between people who just disagree with Rowe to different extents. So that's always in the background lurking. But, whenever you find yourself in one of these groups, let's say, you're Brazilian and you agree with Rowe more on average than Americans and Indians. Well, you have to look and say, do I think there's some reason to think that me, as a Brazilian, or at least this particular Brazilian, am in a better epistemic position with respect to discerning the gratuitousness of this suffering than Americans and Indians? If I don't have any reason to think that I'm in some way in an epistemically superior position with respect to those questions, then it seems minimally that should make you hesitate, should make you ask, what's going on here? What are they not seeing that I'm seeing? Do I have any really reason to think that my judgment is reliable here and theirs is not? And if you can't offer any reason there, it seems like to some degree you should conciliate. You should become less confident that you're getting it right. Now, this, I use the example of Brazilians versus Indians, but this is really true across all of the demographic differences. So if you're, a man and you're looking at women, okay, do I think that I'm in a superior epistemic position as a man to women? Do Hindus think that they're in a superior epistemic, or I guess Hindus really disagree. So do atheists think they're in a superior epistemic position with respect to Hindus? Now, maybe in some of those cases, you could try to sort of give yourself a story as to why, as an atheist, maybe, you could give yourself a story as why you think that you're in a better position with respect to these questions than, say, religious people. But what kind of story are you going to give if you're a man that, that you're going to try to sort of claim epistemic superiority over women? Or if you're in one racial group or ethnic group over another,
or if you're less educated,
if you're less educated, we could ask, why would you think that you're in a better epistemic position than those more educated? Now, to be fair, I'm enough of a common sense chap that, too much philosophy can be bad for the brain. And there are situations where we might think that less educated people are in fact maybe better attuned to discerning things than the people who overthink it. So that's not something to rule out.
Right.
But when you really look, or from the get-go, but when you really look at it and you think, okay, what might education be doing here? And is it likely to have a clarifying effect or a skewing effect? It's either unclear, or to the extent that you can come up with plausible explanations for this difference, it seems like the more educated people might be having a clearer vision of what's going on here. They might be more reliable. So for instance, maybe Ian, do you want to say something about context? Because this is an example where, if you're in the low context group, you think that you're in a superior epistemic position to the high context group.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly where what I'm inclined to say is that if you have that sort of context in mind, that you might be in an epistemically superior position. But I think there's lots of pushback we might get about the role context is playing. And so one sort of line of pushback might be that maybe context or our particular example of context is having the effect that we're seeing because it is too positive. Right? Maybe there is sort of a sneaky theodicy baked into our example of context about when and why forest fires occur. And so maybe that's what's doing the driving. Maybe it's that sneaky theodicy, right? Or maybe we are the kind of critters that just get easily distracted, right? So if you are a defense attorney and some particularly damning evidence has become leveled against your client, well, you might try to minimize the effect that evidence has by sort of telling a bigger story, not because that story is going to excuse the evidence, but just because it's going to allow maybe the jurors to lose sight of it, right? So maybe it's just obscuring the salient evidence. Or we might wonder if maybe the context isn't doing the work that we think it's doing because the context is identifying a point to the suffering. Maybe instead what the context is doing is just making salient all the things we don't know. So maybe participants aren't sort of think, oh, well, that's why the fawn suffered. Maybe they're just being made aware of just the complexities of the situation that might sort of essentially trigger a skeptical theist kind of response. And so there's some pushback about why the context is having the role that we see it having. And so in follow-up research, we're going to try to tease out some of those differences and see what exactly is going on there.
Excellent. All right. Well, why don't we wrap up? You can summarize the discussion however you'd like, but I would like to hear about some of the follow-up experiments.
Sure. So summary, a lot fewer people agreed with Rowe than we thought would. And when you look at the differences, right, between those who agree and those who disagree, there doesn't seem to be any reason that the agreeers, at least no forthcoming reason why they should view themselves to be in a superior epistemic position to those who disagree, especially when they're in a kind of distinct minority. And so if that's the case, then, for one, Rowe's problem of evil may just have a less initial purchase in the population than we might have thought. And even among those to whom it does have initial purchase, they might have some reasons to think, wait, if most other people aren't intuiting the same way, is it rational for me to continue to be as confident as I was, that there are these gratuitous evils out there? So those are the serious problems that these results raise for Rowe's argument. They're not decisive. There are things that you can say in response. One of the things that we're going to follow up on, and Ian, perhaps you can explain what the follow-ups are, is just what exactly is context doing? Because this was one of the most dramatic effects. If you added context, agreement with Rowe, which was already low, went down a lot further. So what's happening there? If we can isolate what exactly context is doing, then perhaps we can get a better idea of whether adding context is making our assessments more reliable or less reliable.
Yeah, that was a good summary. Yeah, so Ian, why don't you mention what you're going to do in future experiments?
Yeah, so we do. One of the biggest concerns I think on our mind is, that measurement question. Are we really measuring agreement with Rowe? And so in follow-up research, we're going to try to expand the Rowe index, the measurement index that we've been using, and we also want to explore the role that context is playing, right? So we might want to say, see whether or not there is a sneaky theodicy going on in that context type by doing a couple different things. So one response might be to say, well, you think that's a theodicy? I'll show you a theodicy, and give an actual full-throated theodicy to participants and see if that has an even greater effect on diminishing the perceptions of pointlessness. Another approach might be to give a sort of woefully negative context to the suffering, right? Where nothing really good is coming from it. There's no sort of positive valence that could be given to the suffering.
I get
more context.
Reading this context, it is painful.
It is brutal. Yeah. Another sort of response we might want to, so both the negative context and the theodicy examples might help us to address the sneaky theodicy objection. Now, we were also going to use a context variable we're calling junk context. And that's just a bunch of information about fires, emitting light, some of the chemistry that goes on when it comes to any sort of fire. And so it's context, but it's not really at all relevant to the fawn example.
Yeah.
But then we give the fawn example. And the thought there is that if that will diminish the perception of pointlessness, then maybe that would lend some credence to this idea that the context is just playing a swamping role. Right, so sort of distracting participants. From actually dialing in on what's important. And then we also are going to use a skeptical theism condition, just really getting people to reflect on what they don't know about this particular case, and how little they know about things in general, and see if that will sort of significantly diminish the perceptions of pointlessness or gratuitousness as well.
Well, that's the work you've already done is super intriguing, and I can't wait to see what these future experiments do. So thank you both for joining me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
Before we wrap up, I'll direct the viewers. If you enjoyed this interview, I know that you'll enjoy listening to my entire playlist of videos on the problem of evil. I've already mentioned some of those that I've done. One that I didn't mention that is relevant to this is I interviewed Dr. Chris Tweet on the common sense problem of evil, and he gave an interesting line of response to that problem, which is very closely related to what we've been discussing here. So thank you very much for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.